According to anthropologists, modern humans or Homo sapiens emerged around 200,000 years ago. By that time, earlier species of the genus Homo had already mastered stone tools, hunting with spears and darts, and using fire. Despite having larger brains, functional hands, and the ability to walk upright, our ancestors still resembled the rest of the animal kingdom. Their way of life was pretty similar to that of other animals. As strange as it may sound, about 95% of our species' existence was spent on hunting, gathering, and a semi-nomadic lifestyle. Essentially, despite their spears replacing canine teeth and their ability to communicate through speech, humans in the Paleolithic era were just another species of effective predators. Looking at Eskimos, some Australian and African tribes, it's clear that humanity could have continued as hunter-gatherers to this day, and perhaps for millions of years to come. However, around 11,000 years ago, humans made a discovery that split history into before and after, laying the foundation for future civilizations. This was the birth of agriculture in the Middle East, marking the Neolithic Revolution. The shift to farming had monumental consequences. A key result was that people stopped moving constantly in search of food. This led to the construction of permanent dwellings. Instead of tents made of hides, they started building earth homes, semi-underground huts, and mud brick houses. Settlements and proto-cities began to emerge. The need to store and prepare food led to the creation of pottery. Fired clay preserves well, and its shapes and decorations reflect the cultural traditions of the people who made it, so pottery is a vital source of information for archaeologists. Farming created a surplus of food, meaning people started producing more than they needed. Some members of society realized they could take this surplus for themselves, freeing them from the hard work of the fields. It quickly became clear that you could gather surplus not just from your own settlement, but from neighboring ones as well. Naturally, farmers weren't keen on sharing their hard-earned grain, and they didn't see it as surplus at all. But here's where things got interesting. The principle likely worked like this. Share your harvest with your own people and get protection, or you'll have to share it with strangers, and who knows how much they'll take. Some of these early Neolithic power players were successful and expanded their territories. They established their right to control the land and its surplus for generations. Over time, their territories grew huge, and the need to manage the surplus led to the creation of some form of record-keeping. This is where writing comes in. In fact, the oldest surviving texts, about 5,000 years old, detail the collection of tributes like pots, baskets, and bundles from controlled territories. But the real topic of this video is something even bigger: civilization. Despite the many complex definitions of the term, civilization in simple terms can be described as a state with cities or large settlements with separate administrative and religious centers. Writing is another key feature. But what is the oldest civilization? While China, which we've talked about in previous videos, often claims to be the oldest surviving civilization, it doesn't even make it into the top 3 when we look at the true origins of civilization. If a modern-day researcher were to land on a planet like Earth, still in a primitive state, they'd have no trouble identifying where future civilizations would emerge. The first thing they'd notice is land south of the 40th parallel north, where major rivers flood regularly. Sure, we can talk about Europe's fertile black soils, but they're not great for primitive farming methods that rely on one harvest per season. Plus, crops can easily be ruined by frost. According to Professor Leshkov's research, from the 11th to the 16th century, Russia experienced famine due to crop failures about every 13 years. The phenomenon of famine caused by poor harvests was only fully overcome in the 20th century. In Central and Western Europe, despite a milder climate, every generation also faced significant crop failures at least a few times in their lives. And let's not forget, the Crusades, aside from their religious aims, also had the goal of seizing fertile lands in the Middle East, where knights set up entire states. It's worth noting that agriculture reached Europe thousands of years after it started in the Middle East. It took about 3,000 years for farming to reach the Balkans, and 4,000 years to reach Western and Central Europe. Europe was very attractive during the Ice Age as a habitat for herds of herbivorous animals. However, with the onset of interglacial periods and the extinction of the mammoth fauna, this area became less appealing. In fact, even today, if we disregard work-related factors, it's hard to imagine anyone migrating from Sochi or Krasnodar to the north. More often than not, it's the other way around. All the ancient civilizations were located in the south. However, the oldest civilization belongs to the Sumerians, who lived in what is now Iraq. This area is also known as the Fertile Crescent. Every year, river floods would fertilize the soil, which was crucial for farming. This process was so important that the later European Tripolite culture had to abandon their settlements every few decades and find new land because the soil around them had been exhausted. Even when forests were burned and the ash used as fertilizer, continuous farming would deplete the soil in just 5 to 7 years, or sometimes even 2 to 3 years. To recover, it would take about 10 to 12 years for the soil and half a century for the forest to regenerate. There are plenty of articles online about different ancient civilizations. These are often based on the dating of specific settlements or artifacts, but it's important to understand that even settlements we might consider cities today were founded long, long ago. For example, Jericho is nearly 10,000 years old, and in modern-day Turkey, there are temple complexes around 12,000 years old. About 9,000 years ago, proto-writing appeared. People began to use graphic symbols to express ideas. Even in Europe, there are similar symbols from the Vinca culture that are about 6,000 years old. However, the first real writing system was the Sumerian cuneiform, which emerged around 5,500 years ago. Interestingly, this early cuneiform is connected to the Egyptian hieroglyphs that came a bit later. By the way, the Sumerians played a role in the development of Egypt, the second oldest civilization, which absorbed elements of the broader Middle Eastern culture. And let's not forget, Egypt's ancestors came from the East. The third of the oldest civilizations is the Indus Valley civilization, located near the Indus River. In a way, we can say that with the creation of the first writing system 5,500 years ago, civilization itself began. The first cities, like Eridu, were built by the Sumerians around 7,500 years ago. It's important to note that writing, until more recent times, was primarily used for state administration. Most people, though, couldn't read or write. For example, in the cultural center of medieval Europe, Byzantium, in the 12th century, only 1% of the population was literate. European knights were often not only illiterate, but looked down on learning. Even in the 19th century, in 1875, about 25% of recruits in Belgium couldn't read or write, and in Italy, the percentage was even higher. In the Russian Empire at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, about 20% of people were literate. Some Russians get upset about the fact that the Cyrillic alphabet, which was borrowed from Greek, is used in their language. But Central and Western European countries also use letters borrowed from Rome and the Latin language to write. Latin script, which, by the way, also comes from the Greek alphabet. So, in a way, European civilization is, to some extent, a reboot of the older, long-gone classical civilizations, which themselves borrowed a lot from the Middle East. By the way, each civilization has had its highs and lows, periods of political and economic crises. There are no perfect conditions anywhere, and droughts or floods were common. Sometimes these periods of decline coincided with barbarian invasions. And since this was a time when cold weapons ruled the day, a charismatic leader with military talent could unite many tribes and topple even large states. So, Rome wasn't the only civilization to fall to barbarian attacks. If we ask whether new, older civilizations might be discovered, it's unlikely. The Sumerians, for example, left behind tons of archaeological finds that have been dug up for centuries and will likely continue to be uncovered for at least that long. During the excavation of Ashurbanipal's library, around 30,000 clay tablets with texts were found. Every civilization leaves behind hundreds of tons of material culture fragments. Even the mere fact that a particular people developed writing is well reflected in archaeology. For instance, when excavating Novgorod, over 1,000 birch bark scrolls were found. So when the media reports a new discovery of an inscription that changes everything, it's wise to approach such claims skeptically. From the Sumerians, we inherited the sexagesimal system, which we still use to measure time and angles. Their mythology also became the foundation of one of today's major religions. In general, nearly every people wants to appear older, to claim political and historical significance. It's a bit paradoxical. The most freedom-loving, rebellious cultures are the ones that rarely create powerful states. Why? Because empires need people who will obey and do the dirty work. Conquering other nations starts with conquering your own people's will.